Thank you. This is our fifth session today in Tactics in Defending the Faith, and I'd like to start out our session today the way I usually do with a brief overview of what we covered last time. In the last session, we covered the suicide tactic. We said that there are some points of view that by nature are self-refuting, they self-destruct. They express contradictory concepts, and therefore they're not only false, but they are necessarily false. Second, we learned how to recognize when a view self-destructs. I encourage you to pay attention to the basic premise or conviction or claim, and then ask yourself if the claim undermines itself. Does the statement satisfy its own requirements? Does it have within it the seeds of its own destruction? Are there any internal contradictions? Third, we examined a number of examples of popular ideas that commit suicide, and we learned how to respond to them. Things like it's wrong to change other people's religious beliefs, or all religions are equally true and valid, or you can only know what's been taught to you by science, or there is no truth. The final thing we did last week is to learn about a concept I called sibling rivalry suicide. Now, this kind of suicide happens when pairs of objections oppose each other and are logically inconsistent. And we can eliminate at least one by pointing out the conflict and then just dealing with the other. Now, in this session, I want to teach you a tactic called taking the roof off. Now, some points of view, if taken seriously, don't actually commit suicide, but they do lead to some very goofy, maybe even absurd conclusions when they're played out consistently. We're going to learn how to recognize those views and then reduce those views to their absurdity. This is also called reductio ad absurdum, or reduced to the absurd. We're going to learn why this tactic works so well. It's based on man's own rebellion against the truth. It makes this tactic very powerful. And finally, we're going to look at some very specific examples of popular ideas that lead to problems that we can exploit by taking the roof off. Now, the taking the roof off tactic is a simple tactic. It's used with great effect by the late Dr. Francis Schaeffer. It's really good with moral issues. It's very good with postmodernists. And it's easy to follow and understand. Here's the tactic in brief. First, you adopt the other person's viewpoint for the sake of argument. You kind of concede that what their point of view is true. You just say, okay, let's go along with that for the sake of argument. Then you press that person to the logical and absurd consequences of the view. Okay? The tactic I mentioned is reductio ad absurdum, because you're reducing to the absurd. You can show how, if you follow it out logically, it produces very controversial or counterintuitive results. And basically the point here is to see whether a person can really live in the kind of world that he's affirming. Can he live with the moral and intellectual consequences of his beliefs? In essence, you're taking their moral and intellectual rules seriously. You're taking them at their word. You are taking their views as if they're true, and then you're applying them consistently to see where they go, and lots of times they'll go to absurd places. Now, the taking the roof off tactic makes it clear that some points of view simply prove too much. And our goal here is to show that everyone who holds views that turn out to be absurd have to pay a really high price for holding that view. And he actually knows better, I think, but he's just being inconsistent. And so this tactic will move us in that direction. Here's how to take off the roof for somebody's argument step by step. First, you want to reduce the point of view to its basic premise, its fundamental assertion or principle or moral rule. And this is similar to what we've done in the past. Requires us to pay attention to what's going on. We're involved. We're listening. We're listening to a point of view, and you're saying, okay, basically what this person is saying is this. This is the fundamental concept. And then we ask ourselves a question. We say, if this were really true, this point that he's either explicitly or implicitly advancing, what would happen? What would be the consequences of such a view? Do any absurd conclusions result? Can this point of view be consistently applied? Okay. Does the rule have other unintended consequences, maybe? Does it lead to a so-called truth that just seems wrong. Now, if you find something, you want to invite the other person to consider the implications of his view, the absurd end that follows if you follow their convictions. I'm going to give you some examples of this in a minute, but first I want to tell you why this tactic works so well. As a point of fact, if Christianity is true, as a point of fact, human beings are actually made in the image of God, and they must live in the world that God created. Consequently, every person who rejects this has to live in some kind of contradiction. Remember that atheist I talked about in the last session, the animal rights activist who didn't want to believe in God but wanted to hang on to objective moral concepts like rights, in this case animal rights? I mean, she didn't believe in God, but she knew that there were some creatures that had transcendent value. In this case, I think she was a little confused on the animal thing. But these two concepts didn't go together. If she was really consistent, she would have to surrender one or the other, because consistency in being an atheist did not lead to the conclusions that she held. Now, Schaeffer called this the point of tension. He said basically people know better deep down inside, even when they deny it. He said that man has, therefore, subconsciously erected a defense, a roof, so to speak, to protect him from considering the consequences of his beliefs. Simply put, he's in denial. And our goal is to remove the roof. It's to expose the fraud. It's to deprive that person of his false sense of security. And this is where a well-placed question, the third one in the Columbo tactic, for example, is really going to serve you well. We want to cause this person to feel a little pain, okay? But in a good way. We want to push him off balance. We want to direct him towards the logic, or in this case, the illogic, the absurdity of his own beliefs. Now, of course, in order to do this, we're going to first have to understand what that person's beliefs are. We have to pay attention in our conversation. We've talked about this before. This is where your Columbo tactics are going to come in. Let's take a look at some examples of the kinds of things that I think fall victim to a taking the roof off tactic. Here's a simple one, very obvious. I had a caller once call me on my radio show and said, my teacher in high school does not believe in morality. She's a relativist. How do I refute her? I said to him, steal her stereo. Now, of course, they didn't really want him to take it, but the point is, what would be wrong from the teacher's perspective of stealing the stereo? She certainly can't say that it's violating a moral principle. She doesn't believe in that kind of thing. Basically, and remember I said to look for the underlying moral principle or intellectual principle there and take it for a test drive. The underlying principle here is there are no objective moral rules. Okay, if we take that for a test drive, we see where it leads, how you apply it in everyday life. It turns out if there are no moral rules, then nothing's wrong, including stealing stereos. But that's absurd. The teacher is immediately going to feel ill-abused if you steal her stereo. She's going to say you did something wrong. Stealing is wrong. Therefore, the implication, there must be some objective moral truths. How about this popular argument for homosexuality? Some people are convinced that if homosexuality can be shown to be innate, if it's genetic, then this somehow justifies the morality of homosexuality. Well, this isn't going to work. Their idea is if it's natural, it's moral. I had a fellow call me on the radio show once. His name was Marty, and he raised this concern. He described to me how in his own life, from the time he was very, very young, he had this urge, he had this desire. There never was a time when he didn't feel this way, and he was convinced that his homosexual desire was natural for him. Therefore, he said, I had no right to claim that homosexuality was wrong. Okay? So what's going on here? What's his underlying moral principle? That if it's natural, then it's right. Well, I applied that for him. I said, let me ask you a question. What if I told you that I had a natural impulse that I've had since I was a child? And whenever I'm in a certain set of circumstances, this natural impulse rises to the surface. It was the same thing that he was saying to me about homosexuality. I was following it point for point. But then I told him what the natural impulse was. And that impulse was, and I told him I didn't believe this, but it's just an example, that whenever I get around a homosexual, I want to beat his brains out. Gay bashing. Now, he got really mad at me. And I said, hey, listen, Marty, I don't actually believe this. I think that's wrong, but I want to know how you can think it's wrong in light of the rationale, the logic of your point of view that you just raised in favor of your homosexuality. You said, if it's natural, then it's right. Now, that's not going to work. It's not going to work because, for one, it's a logical fallacy. It doesn't follow that just because certain things are a certain way, that they should be that way. It's the is-ought fallacy, or also called the naturalistic fallacy. But really, more to the point, in our circumstances, the point of morality, isn't it, when you think about it, is to keep us from doing what comes naturally. Animals always do what comes naturally. Human beings, on the other hand, take their natural impulses under the control of morality, and therefore you can see why a natural impulse is not a justification morally for anything. One could put it this way: the difference between just doing what comes naturally and principled self-restraint is called civilization. That's the backstory. I exploit it by giving the illustration. I take his point of view as true for the sake of argument, and I show where it logically leads to an absurd result. I take the roof off. In this case, the basic premise was, if it's natural, then it's moral. I took the roof off, and I showed that if that works, then there are a whole bunch of things that you could say are natural, but turn out not to be moral. Therefore, the truth is, just because it's natural, even if it is, I'm not even conceding that that's the case for homosexuality, but even if it turned out to be, it doesn't mean it's moral, or else gay bashing would be just fine on that way of thinking. Ever hear somebody say, well, anything's okay to do as long as it doesn't hurt anybody? Now, usually they're trying to say this in order to get out from underneath some other moral principle you're applying to their life. They're saying, well, I'm not hurting anybody, therefore I can't be said to be doing anything wrong. Well, this is called the minimalist ethic. In other words, it's an ethical principle that's kind of the minimal rule that you have in a society like ours that everybody can kind of agree on. The problem is, I think, that this minimalist ethic is too minimal, because we can ask ourselves the question, by giving it a test drive, given the fact, the rule, I can do anything as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, then what follows from that? Well, it's going to be really hard to prosecute peeping toms, isn't it? They're not hurting anybody. They may be looking in your window when you're taking a bath, but they're not hurting you, right? It's going to be very hard to prosecute dentists or doctors who molest people while they're under the influence of anesthesia, right? Because they're not hurting anyone. They were out cold. They didn't feel a thing. In fact, on this ethic, you can't even nail necrophilia. It's having sex with dead people. Now, it does seem that there's something wrong with peeping toms, necrophiliacs, and people who molest others under the influence of anesthesia. But this isn't covered on this point of view. If you follow this point of view to its logical conclusion, all of those things would be fine. It turns out that the truth is the minimalist ethic is not an adequate moral system. The minimalist ethic is too minimal. Now, we want to do an interactive here to practice a couple of these things yourself, and after you've worked on them, we'll come back and we'll talk about them as a group. I want you to break into groups of 4 or 5 and consider the ideas listed in your workbook on page 83. I want you to look at them and try to find the absurdity. Discover the inconsistency. Look at the basic premise and then give it a test drive. I've already done the first one for you in my examples that I just gave you. Do the rest of them. Take about 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll come back and work on them together. All right, how'd you do? Well, let's go over them one by one, and I'll give you some insights into those challenges there. Here's the first one. It was atheistic evolution. Now, here's the question. If atheistic evolution is true, there is no God, natural forces are responsible for everything, why don't we just follow the rule of evolution as a society? if there's no fundamental difference between animals and human beings, that we are all just evolved, then how can we make moral distinctions between them? Why can't we just let the strong rule the weak? Now, it seems to me that there's a reason why we gas termites and not human beings. There's a reason why we can separate the weak in our cattle, but we are horrified when Hitler did that to Jews, because we know that there is a difference morally between animals and human beings. However, if you follow naturalistic evolution, you can't get to that place. We're just all molecules clashing in the universe. We're just all fighting for survival. There is no right and wrong about these kinds of things. Now, if it turns out that it's pretty obvious that what Hitler did was wrong, and that we shouldn't be weeding out the weak from our own midst, which is what would follow if you carried this to its logical conclusion, then there must be something wrong with this point of view. No, when we think about it, there are real moral obligations. It is wrong to prey upon the weak, and therefore evolution is not adequate to explain the world the way we see it. God must exist to ground moral principles. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference and on the East Coast, and a gentleman came up to me. We had a table for Stand to Reason. And he announced to me that he was personally against abortion, but he didn't think there should be any laws against it. Now, this is called the modified pro-choice position. It's a favorite of politicians, and it allows them to kind of have their foot in both worlds. And I'm going to show you that this isn't going to work, because once we clearly understand the point of view and we take the roof off, we show where it logically leads. It's going to turn out that this point of view is actually barbaric. Now, when anybody says to you, listen, I think personally that abortion is wrong, but I don't think we should have any laws against it, that's up to other people. I can't force my views on them. You always want to ask a clarification question first. And here's that question. Why is it that you think that abortion is wrong? You said you wouldn't have an abortion. Why wouldn't you? The answer I almost always get from someone else is that, well, I personally believe that abortion takes the life of an innocent human being, but that's my personal view. I can't force that on other people. And I said to this gentleman after he told me that, I said, let me repeat your view back to you. I'm going to take the spin off of it, but I'm just going to repeat it back to him, I said, and you tell me what you think about it. Okay? So I have an understanding of his view. I am going to take the roof off. I'm going to show him what his view actually consists of. I said to him, you just told me that you actually do in fact believe that abortion takes the life of an innocent human being, and you also believe that women should be allowed to do that. He said, well, when you put it that way. I said, put it what way? That's your view. I mean, if I misunderstood it, let me know, but I thought that's what I heard you say. And he stood there shuffling his feet. That's exactly what his view amounted to. I didn't get it wrong. Listen, if you think that abortion actually takes the life of an innocent human being, why on God's good earth would you ever think that it's okay for someone else to do that? Why would you ever want the law to protect that kind of activity? You see, this point leads to an absurd conclusion. I run into another point, too, with capital punishment. You know, a couple of years ago here in California, Governor Wilson was ready to have executed Robert Alton Harris, who is a multiple killer. He was an awful human being, deserved what he got as far as I'm concerned. He was on death row. Mother Teresa contacted the governor of this state and asked for his sentence to be commuted. And this was the rationale that she gave. Now think about this. Why should the governor commute the sentence to life from the death penalty? She said, because Jesus would forgive. Now remember, I said this tactic helps people to see that sometimes their arguments prove too much. This is an example of that. Because what would Mother Teresa have the good governor do with Robert Alton Harris if he wasn't going to go through with the execution? Well, put him in prison for the rest of his life. But see, now I have a question for Mother Teresa. And what is the question? Her point of view, her line of thinking, her rationale. Why put him in prison? Jesus would forgive. Well, maybe not life, maybe just 10 years, but Jesus would forgive. What about 10 days? No days at all. If we take this rationale to be a legitimate way of approaching the question of social justice and the role and responsibility of the government to punish criminals, well, then we should empty the prisons. That's the absurd conclusion that follows from this line of thinking. With all respects to Mother Teresa, this is not a good reason to commute the sentence of a deadly killer. Her view proved too much. We talked about the concept that there is no truth. Here's a variation of that. Sometimes people will say, well, look, if there is no truth, let's face it, therefore we should be tolerant of each other. Notice they put it in the form of an argument. Since there is no truth, what follows from that is that we should be tolerant of each person and their differences. But let's accept their point of view for the sake of argument, that there is no truth. Does it follow from the idea that there is no truth that we now have an obligation to be tolerant? No, not at all. In fact, it seems just the opposite. That would be a good reason not to tolerate anybody. Because if there is no truth, they don't have it. And if there is no truth, then there are no moral truths like I ought to tolerate other people. And therefore, I have no obligation to tolerate anyone. But if it seems like we really have a moral obligation to treat other people who differ from us with respect and kindness, that kind of tolerance is an obligation, well then by golly, it's not the case that there is no truth. One of my favorite examples of taking the roof off comes from a story that philosopher Christina Hoff Sommers talks about in one of her books. There was a program that was in our educational system in the past called values clarification. And the way values clarification worked is the children were given exercises to do of a moral nature, and there were no right answers. They were just told to clarify their own values and come up with their own answers to these things. And it's not so much popular anymore in the States. They have different means of doing this now, but it's a very relativistic approach. And in Newton, Massachusetts, there was a 6th grade teacher that was teaching her students this kind of thing. Well, they got the picture. And the 6th graders came up to her afterwards and said that they'd huddled together and they discussed their values, which they had now clarified, and they decided that according to their own value system, now they should be allowed to cheat on tests. Now, you can imagine what the teacher might be thinking. First, she might think, gee, they were listening. Oh, good. Yeah. And then she might think, oh, my gosh, they were listening. They heard what I said. They are applying it consistently. Because that certainly follows, doesn't it? But you see, there's something wrong with that. If the conclusion that follows naturally from the point of view turns out to be absurd, something is wrong with the point of view. The fact is, the point of view is an example of someone in denial of the truth. And when we see the absurdity, it's because we know what the truth actually is. I'll tell you how she responded to these kids, by the way. Here's what she said. Since this is my class, you've heard this one before, right? And I value honesty, you are not free to cheat in my class. Now, in other classes, you can cheat. But not in my class. Now, let me ask you a question. Is it a good reason for her students not to cheat that she values honesty, given the teachings of values clarification? Absolutely not. That's a good reason for her not to cheat. It's no reason at all for her students not to cheat. So at very best, you have a contradiction. At worst, you have what philosophers call argumentum ad baculum, or to paraphrase Mao, persuasion from the barrel of a gun. You know, I've got the power, you got to do what I say. Let me give you I think a powerful example of how I use this concept of taking the roof off on college campuses. Remember, the concept here is that people actually really know the truth. And they are denying it, living in this world that rejects God, but in so doing, they cannot live with the logical consequences of their belief. And so there's this point of tension. They can't make everything fit. Whenever I go on a university campus, and I've talked in more than 35 universities, many of them non-Christian, addressing non-Christian audiences, I always try to make this illustration. In fact, I did it in Berkeley when I lectured there last year. I did 2 nights at Berkeley, and Friday night and Saturday night, and filled up one of the halls there on campus for overflow rooms. It was a great evening as I talked about moral relativism on Friday night and religious relativism or pluralism on Saturday night. The idea that Jesus is the only way. In fact, that was the title of my talk on the second lecture at Berkeley. So you can imagine that was a fun evening. But I made a particular point, because at the end of my conversation about relativism, I said, now that relativism has been defeated, and I'd given, I thought, a very compelling argument against relativism, some form of moral objectivism must be true. There are moral rules out there that apply to us. And then I said, this has explanatory power. I said, there's something I know about every single person in this room that you know about yourself, that you're trying to keep from other people, but I know about it, and you don't know I know about it, but I got you figured out. You haven't kept it from me. And what is that secret? The secret is you have a bad self-image. How do I know that? Because everybody does, I told them. We all look down, including me. We look down inside of ourselves and we see something there we do not like. We see something ugly and twisted and broken, and the thing that's twisted and broken is moral. Something evil down there lurks. We try to keep it from other people, but we cannot keep it from ourselves. And that awareness of our moral brokenness has a feeling. And that feeling has a name. What do you think, I ask the non-believing audience, the word is that we use to describe the feeling of our moral brokenness? And they all get it right. Guilt. They feel guilty. I said, now let me ask you a question. Why do we feel guilty? Some people say, well, this is culture, and maybe it's Jewish guilt or Catholic guilt or some other kind. Who knows? Maybe that's that's a possibility. I can explain that. All right, that's a possibility. But let me offer you another possibility. Given the failure of relativism and the reality of moral principles, maybe there's another explanation that ought to be in the running. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we feel guilty because we are guilty. Is that a possibility? Is that in the running? And the answer to guilt is not denial. That's relativism. The answer, I tell them, to guilt is forgiveness. And this is where Jesus comes in. And you see, what I am doing here is I am aware that these people have a point of tension. They are in denial. They are denying God's existence. They are denying morality. They are denying sin, but they know better. They can deny it to me. They can deny it to their friends, but they cannot deny it to themselves. And so consequently, I can speak directly to that reality, and this is what I've done. That's taking the roof off, moving a person to the logical and absurd conclusion of what he believes. In Schaeffer's words, we confront men with reality, we remove their protection and their escapes, and we allow the avalanches to fall. So, what are the main points that we've covered in this session? Taking the roof off. First, we learned to adopt the other person's point of view for the sake of argument. And once we've adopted it, then we learn to press him to the logical and absurd conclusions of his view. This involves 3 steps. First, we have to pay attention to the view. We have to reduce the point of view to its basic premise or idea. Then we have to give the idea kind of a test drive. We want to see if any absurd consequences follow when we apply it consistently. And finally, then, we want to invite the other person to consider the implications of a view that turns out to be absurd so that they might see what the truth of the matter actually is. We also had a little more insight onto why this tactic works, that man is made in the image of God, and he's got to live in the kind of world that God created. And if he denies those things, then he must live in some kind of tension, a point of tension. He has erected, to deal with this tension, a roof over himself, a bit of protection, to shield himself from the logical implications of his beliefs. And our job is to remove that roof, to remove that protection, to make him hurt a little bit, to deprive him of his false sense of security. The final thing we learned in this session is a number of ways to apply that tactic to specific challenges. Now, in the next and final session, I want to cover with you an indispensable tactic. I'm going to teach you how to handle that overbearing, overwhelming, over-obnoxious interrupter called a steamroller. In the meantime, you got some homework to do. I want you to take the things that you have learned here in the last few sessions and keep putting them into practice. Have some interaction so you've got some stories to tell next time around. And I want you also go to your workbooks and read the extra short articles in the Food for Thought section you'll find at the back of the section of this particular session on taking the roof off. I will see you next week.